The rain came down over the city like bad news through a leaky roof. July 25, 2026, close to midnight. The kind of hour when honest traffic thins out and the crooked packets start moving through back alleys of the network. I was in my office with a cold cup of coffee, a warm terminal, and 4 files on the desk. 1 armed robbery, 3 murders, 3 repeat offenders caught in the act. The sort of lineup that tells you the night is not going to end clean. First case, CVE 2026-27771, Gitea, high severity CVSS 822, an armed robbery with an informant's tip, EPSS 41%. Not in the KEV ledger, not yet, but it had the smell of a quiet job, the kind where the thief does not kick the door in. He just finds the clerk asleep and reads what was never meant for him. The break in the lock is insufficient permission checking, closest to CVE-862, missing authorization. The weak spot sits around Composer package source links in Gitea versions up to and including 1.26.1. The attack chain is simple enough to make a tired man nervous. An attacker reaches a Composer package view or related package metadata route. Gitea processes the request and builds source link information for the package. But the permission gate does not properly confirm that the requester is allowed to see the underlying private or internal repository reference. The result is not direct code execution. It is exposure. Source URLs, internal project names, private repository paths, and package origin details can leak into the street. The scope is any Gitea deployment running 1.26.1 or earlier, including self-hosted Forge installs used by small shops, DevOps teams, open source communities, and private engineering groups that chose Gitea because it is light, fast, and easy to run. That also means it often sits close to source code, build scripts, tokens, CI configuration, and release packages. An attacker gains read access to sensitive package source information, which can support reconnaissance, targeted phishing, dependency confusion, supply chain compromise, and lateral movement into a build environment. Exploitation may require access to the package interface, but it should not require admin privilege if the route exposes data before authorization is properly enforced. The clean move is to upgrade Gitea to 1.26.2 or later, or the vendor's current fixed release if your package channel names it differently. Until that patch is in, restrict access to package registry endpoints, especially Composer package routes, to trusted network ranges or authenticated users with a real need. Sysadmins and DevOps should inventory every Gitea instance, including lab and staging boxes. Security teams should review web access logs for unusual requests to package registry and Composer endpoints, especially repeated enumeration of package names, repository paths, or source metadata. Developers should assume exposed package origin data may help an attacker map private code. But that was not the only body on the slab tonight. Second file, CVE-2026-630303330, WordPress. Critical severity 339.8, EPSS 39%. A murder and a repeat offender caught in the act. KEV says the perp is already working the neighborhood. When WordPress bleeds, the city notices. It powers a wide stretch of the public web, from mom-and-pop storefronts to media sites, schools, agencies, and plug-in-heavy business portals. The technical wound is route confusion in the WordPress REST API batch endpoint, chained with SQL injection and WPQ query author tracked as CVE-2026-63030, tracked as CVE-2026-6303013.7.k. The likely CWE pair is CWE-89, improper neutralization of special elements used in an SQL command, and an access control or routing confusion weakness. The attack chain goes like this. The attacker sends a crafted REST API batch request to the WordPress endpoint that bundles or redirects sub-requests in a way the root handler interprets incorrectly. That confusion lets the attacker reach a code path where author is passed into wquery without proper handling. The malicious value alters the SQL query. From there, the attacker can read or modify database content. With the right conditions, such as writable theme files, plugin upload paths, admin session theft, or database manipulation of scheduled tasks and options, that SQL injection can become remote code execution. The affected range is WordPress 6.9.x before 6.9.x before 7.0.x before 7.0.x before 7.0.x before 7.0.x before WordPress is everywhere, and many installs expose the REST API to the internet by design. An unauthenticated attacker may be able to trigger the chain over the network if the vulnerable route is reachable and default controls are in place. What they gain can begin as database read access, including user records, password hashes, private content, API keys stored by plugins, and configuration secrets. It can escalate to write access, site takeover, web shell placement, malware injection, SEO spam, credential theft, and ransomware staging against the hosting account. The remedy is direct. Upgrade WordPress 6.9.x to 6.9.x to 7.0.x to 7.0.x to 7.0.x. If you cannot patch tonight, restrict access to the REST API batch endpoint at the web server or WAF, disable batch processing if your environment allows it, and block suspicious author not in payloads containing SQL metacharacters, comments, union clauses, stacked query attempts, or encoded variants. Web admins, hosting teams, DevOps, and security teams all have a seat at this table. Watch access logs for post traffic to REST API batch routes, odd query patterns involving author notin, spikes in 500 errors, new admin accounts, modified theme or plugin files, and unexpected outbound connections from the web server. I barely had time to light another cigarette when the next file landed on my desk. Third case, CVE-2026-48282. Adobe ColdFusion. Critical severity, CVSS 10-10. EPSS 29%. Another murder. Another repeat offender caught in the act. ColdFusion has been walking dangerous streets for years, often deep inside enterprise application stacks where old business logic still pays the rent. This one is path traversal, CVE-22, improper limitation of a path name to a restricted directory. The attacker sends a crafted HTTP request containing traversal sequences or encoded path manipulation to a vulnerable ColdFusion component. The server-side handler fails to properly normalize, validate, or confine the requested path to the intended directory. Instead of staying in the locked room, the request walks up the staircase, crosses the hall, and reaches files or execution paths it should never touch. In this case, the flaw can lead to arbitrary code execution in the context of the current user. That may mean writing or invoking a ColdFusion markup language file, reaching an administrative function, or placing executable content where the ColdFusion service will process it. The affected version service will process it. The affected versions are Adobe ColdFusion 2023-20, Byte 20 and earlier releases in those branches. No user interaction is required. That matters. The attacker does not need a clerk to open a poisoned invoice. He just needs the server exposed and the vulnerable path reachable. ColdFusion remains common in government, finance, healthcare, education, and long-lived enterprise application environments. A successful attacker gains code execution as the ColdFusion service account. From there, the road can lead to database theft, web shell deployment, credential harvesting from configuration files, lateral movement through service accounts, ransomware staging, and quiet long-term persistence. The patch path is urgent. Upgrade to Adobe ColdFusion 2025.0 or later, or ColdFusion 2023.21 or later, according to the branch you run and Adobe's current security bulletin. If patching must wait, restrict ColdFusion administrative and application endpoints to trusted IP ranges, block traversal patterns at the WAF, disable unused ColdFusion services, and ensure the ColdFusion service account has minimal file permission. Application owners, Windows and Linux sysadmins, DevOps, and security operations should move together. Detection starts with web logs containing .sedu, encoded forms like pet2e%2e%2s, double encoded traversal, unexpected requests to CFIDE or administrator paths, newly created .cfm files, child processes spawned by the ColdFusion service, and outbound command and control traffic from the application host. The night was far from over. Fourth file, CVE-2026-5805222. Microsoft Office SharePoint Server, critical severity, CVSS 9.8, EPSS 21%. A murder, and KEV says the killer has already been seen with blood on his coat. It is the file cabinet, the meeting room, the records vault, and sometimes the front door to the whole enterprise. The broken mechanism is deserialization of untrusted data, CVE-502. An unauthorized attacker sends a crafted network request to a vulnerable SharePoint endpoint that accepts or processes serialized object data. SharePoint hands that data to a deserialization routine before proving it is safe. The object graph contains attacker-controlled types or values that trigger dangerous behavior during reconstruction. Instead of merely reading data, the server instantiates objects and runs code paths the attacker shaped. The result is remote code execution over the network without valid credentials if the vulnerable endpoint is exposed and the target is unpatched. The affected product is Microsoft Office SharePoint Server and vulnerable supported builds before the security update addressing CVE-2026-5522. SharePoint is heavily deployed in large enterprise, government, education, and regulated environments, often integrated with Active Directory, document workflows, intranet portals, and runs collaboration data. A successful attacker gains code execution in the SharePoint server context. That can mean stealing documents, dumping secrets, planting web shells, pivoting to SQL Server, harvesting service account credentials, tampering with workflow data, and moving laterally through the domain. Because KEV marks it as a repeat offender caught in the act, assume internet-facing SharePoint farms are already being tested. The fix is to apply Microsoft's July 2026 SharePoint Server Security Update for your exact SharePoint edition and build, or any later cumulative update that includes the CVE 2026-50522 patch. If you run a farm, every server gets the update, then the SharePoint configuration wizard or config step must complete cleanly. As a temporary measure, restrict SharePoint exposure to VPN or trusted reverse proxy paths, block suspicious serialized payload patterns at the WAF, and remove direct internet access where possible. SharePoint admins, Windows teams, identity teams, and security operations should review IS logs for unusual post requests to SharePoint application pages, unexpected 500 errors, new files and web directories, suspicious WWP child process activity, PowerShell launched by worker processes, and outbound traffic from SharePoint servers to unfamiliar hosts. 4 cases. 1 lesson written in rainwater and log entries. The crooks are not always breaking glass. Sometimes they ask the wrong endpoint the right question. Sometimes they confuse a route, poison a query, climb out of a directory, or smuggle a weapon inside serialized data. Patch WordPress first if it faces the public web. Patch ColdFusion and SharePoint with the urgency you reserve for a siren in the night. Lock down Gitea before leaked package clues become the map to your build room. Read the logs. Watch the child processes. Treat KEV like a wanted poster and EPSS like a whisper from an informant who has been right too many times. This is Jack Cipher closing the file for tonight. Keep your servers patched, your endpoints watched, and your secrets out of the rain.